heard people say that the majority of the Jewish people don't support the policy of the Israeli government when it comes to Palestine and Gaza and the West Bank. And how could that be? And can you speak to that? Like, I know the Likud party is like the extremist party, a right-wing party in Israel. What would you say the percentage of support they actually have in the population inside of Israel and out?
Well, we should be clear that, number one, Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of the state of Israel, he's been the head of state now for about a decade, and he's gone through many elections. And even though he's surrounded by one scandal after another, none of these scandals have actually made a big dent in his popularity. And the reason for that, I think, is pretty straightforward. It's pretty uncontroversial, at any rate, in my opinion. That is to say, Benjamin Netanyahu is an obnoxious, racist, Jewish supremacist. And in all of those descriptives, obnoxious, racist, Jewish supremacist, he's wholly representative of the Israeli population. And the reason they keep re-electing him, despite the scandals, which are always said to be imminently going to bring him down, despite the scandals that never bring him down, it's because when they look at Benjamin Netanyahu, most of the Israeli population, they see themselves. And they vote for him because in his mental outlook, I wouldn't really call it values, because I don't think people like Mr. Netanyahu have any values per se. But in terms of mental outlook, contempt for Arabs, contempt for Muslims. Actually, with all due respect to you, Mr. Dorr, and all your listeners, unless they're Jewish, he has contempt for all of you. He's a Jewish supremacist, but he also happens to be in a separate category, a racist. And now, even though I don't like to use that terminology because it's too simple and too sloganeering, it happens to be, I think, in this particular circumstance, it's illuminating. Why did Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Trump get along so well? Why is Mr. Netanyahu Mr. Trump's biggest cheerleader in the world? Well, the answer is simple. They both like walls. Mr. Trump wants to build a wall to keep out Mexicans. Mr. Netanyahu wants to build a wall to keep out Arabs. They both hate black people. Mr. Netanyahu, when President Obama was the head of state in the United States, Mr. Netanyahu, he didn't see it at all amiss. He didn't see it at all awry for him to come barging in the United States, barging into the Capitol building and instructing, telling Obama what American policy should be towards Iran. I dare say, and of course you're free to contradict me, it's inconceivable. Had there been a white head of state, had it been George Bush, or even a Jimmy Carter, had it been even a Jimmy Carter, Mr. Netanyahu would not have dared carry on the way he did with Obama. He's a racist. And just like Mr. Trump, the racist, loathes Muslims, so Mr. Netanyahu, he loathes black people, which is why he made it a part of his policy to expel the Arab migrants, about 30,000, who were fleeing a war situation, fleeing very serious, life-challenging situations, and came as refugees to Israel. And he loathed it because you have to remember, Mr. Netanyahu, he grew up, a large part of his life was spent in the United States. His father, Professor Netanyahu, was a professor at Cornell University, and they hated black people, the Schwarzes as it's called, the black people, they loathed them. And so now for Mr. Netanyahu to have to face the prospect that the Schwarzes are invading Israel, so they have to go. And so it's that same mindset. It's not values, it's a mindset. You can choose what descriptive you want for that mindset. Some people would say it's a Nazi mindset. Some people would say it's a fascist mindset. Some people would call it a right-wing white supremacist white mindset, whatever you want to call it. They have it. And that's the Israeli people. It's a sorry thing to have to say, but I'm not one of those people who, in the name of political correctness, recoil at generalizations. If you could say most white people in the American South in the pre-civil rights era, if you could say most of them were mean, white, racist supremacists, very few people would take issue with that quote unquote generalization. But the moment you use exactly those same terms to describe Israel or Israelis, it suddenly becomes politically incorrect. I disagree. If you want to understand the Israeli mentality vis-a-vis Palestinians or Arabs or Muslims, it's very easy for an American to understand. Just look at Alabama, Mississippi, and all the other southern states in the pre-civil rights era. That's the mentality. That's the Israeli mentality. And Mr. Netanyahu, in his mindset, he's not very much different from a George Wallace or a Lester Maddox, for those who remember that era.
So let me ask you: Do the Jewish people or the people of Israel, do they not see the tremendous irony or that's actually being played out right now? That the Israeli state was invented as a safe haven for the Jewish people because they've been persecuted. And now they turn around and for the last couple of decades, they've been doing the exact same thing or a very horrible thing, not the exact same thing, but a very similar thing to the Palestinian people, making them be second-class citizens, stripping them of rights, controlling their movements in and out of wherever they go, and also having economic blockades and medical blockades. And, like we've said, it's an open-air prison. Do they really miss the irony of that? Do they not see that?
Yes, I do think they don't see it. I do think they miss the irony. First of all, remember, a large portion of Europeans who came to the United States, the Pilgrims, the Puritans, they were fleeing religious persecution. And then they proceeded to inflict really quite grotesque crimes on the indigenous population when they came here. The fact of the matter is, just as the Euro settlers, white settlers who came here, the Euro Americans, they couldn't conceive the domestic population, the indigenous population, they couldn't conceive them as being human beings of the same order as themselves. They were savages. And the same way, the Israeli people can't conceive Arabs or Muslims as being on the same moral order as themselves. They're terrorists or they're savages. So I think it's correct to say that they don't see anything awry in the way they're carrying on. In fact, if you read most of the testimonies of Israelis on the situation there, most Israelis haven't a jot of interest in what goes on in the West Bank and Gaza. They live very good lives. They have a very high standard of living. They travel a lot. And the West Bank and Gaza, these are far off, distant, almost exotic places for Israelis. I know that might come as a surprise, but remember, for example, when I was growing up, living in New York City, it's a compact city, as I suppose you know. 99% of white New Yorkers talked about Harlem, were terrified of Harlem, but had never stepped foot in Harlem. Mm-hmm. They had never seen it, let alone physically place themselves there. So, and it was a funny thing back then, when Europeans came over, visitors, young people, where you'd ask them, where are you living? And they would all say, Harlem, of course. Yeah, because for them, Harlem was exciting. It was clubs, it was jazz. But for white New Yorkers, Harlem was some sort of site of terror. Terror. Everyone was, Harlem, you live in Harlem. Oh my God. And I remember when I first went over to the occupied territories in 1988. So I lived with some families in the West Bank. And I told Israelis, I went to the West. You went to the West Bank. I mean, their eyes bulged. It's a foreign place to them.
I mean, it's amazing these